as an observer, all I have are my conscious experiences. I actually, the notion of something physical beyond my conscious experiences is actually the leap, right?
Absolutely.
I look around.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. The only thing we have is what we, it's the cogito ergo sum type story.
And, absolutely. And so we're on the same page on that. And I agree. I don't know that your world of experiences is anywhere similar to mine. I can never know that. But what I do know is that consciousness is what I know firsthand. What I call inanimate matter is an extrapolation. What's directly available to me are experiences, conscious experiences. And what I call an unconscious physical world is an extrapolation that I'm making. What I only have are my conscious experiences. I have nothing else.
If you take away let's go back to, I hadn't thought about this before this conversation, but let's go back to the nematodes, okay? Which have precisely defined, neural nets, where there really is a way to say, nematode number one feels this. And do you believe that if I could accurately measure kind of the electrochemistry of the nematode, that I would capture kind of that's the whole story? Or do you believe that there's something that is kind of beyond the physical that is kind of not capturable by any physical measurement, that is what, is something about what the nematode feels?
What we call physical is going to be something inside a four-dimensional space-time, which is going to be just what I, as a particular observer, can observe because I am the kind of observer I am. The reality beyond that four-dimensional space-time that I happen to observe is infinitely complicated, and I may need to go to that other deeper reality to give you a full... Okay. So in that sense, what I can do in terms of a physical thing inside space-time is probably trivial and probably inadequate.
I understand. So I mean, this is at some level, I could unkindly say it's kind of a Victorian theory, okay? Because it posits that there is what we have physically in our minds, but and what we can sort of tell is there, but then there's a spirit world which is beyond that might be, for example, in the ruliad, for sure, in my view, we see just tiny little slices of the ruliad, and there's much more there. For the things that, so one of the questions is it enough for doing physics that we sample only that tiny slice of the ruliad? It might not be. It might be the case that we would sample that slice of the ruliad and miracles would keep on happening. Weird random things would keep on happening that kind of poke in from other parts of the ruliad that we weren't able to sense, so to speak. And that, in other words, that it isn't a closed system, that the part of the ruliad that we are slicing, the slice that we're taking isn't closed enough. And so, we constantly are being exposed to other things. So an analogy, in fluid dynamics, for example, most of the time, it's okay to just think of a fluid as with a velocity field and things like that. Occasionally, you actually, if you're making a hypersonic airplane, you have to care about the fact that the fluid is made of molecules. But that's a rare case. But it could be that there are things about the world, perhaps even your consciousness things about the world, where aspects of the ruliad poke through, and it isn't self-consistent to just look at the slice we know we can kind of know that we can observe. So that's an interesting question of to what extent is the pocket of reducibility, as I would call it, the kind of slice where we can say things about what's going to happen, to what extent is that closed? And to what extent does it have things feeding into it? By the way, there's an analogy of this in mathematics, which is kind of to what extent can you do mathematics at the level of kind of talking about things like the Pythagorean theorem, or can you talk about the Pythagorean theorem, or every time you mention it, do you have to go back and say, oh, and the definition of real numbers that I'm using is this, and they're the following axioms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which is kind of like going down to the level of molecules and talking about the fluid. So I think it is a non-trivial claim, but a thing that that I think we are deriving in, for example, our models of physics, that there is a sort of self-consistent layer that can be talked about merely in terms of general relativity and quantum mechanics and so on, without looking down below at the details of the whole hypergraph and all these atoms of space doing all their complicated things. It is a scientific claim that it is enough to merely look at this kind of continuum level of general relativity and so on. By the way, a thing that we would really love to do is to see things, other things poking through. I mean, that's what, when people observed molecules, they have water, fluid, but yet they saw that these little grains of pollen were kicked around in Brownian motion, and that showed there was something below just this fluid description of water. And we'd love to find the same kind of thing for physical space. And that's one of my big activities right now, is trying to see, is there an effect? Are we going to be lucky? Because molecules, people were pretty lucky. Molecules were big enough that you could actually see them in 1900, so to speak. Whether we will be able to see the atoms of space, so to speak, in my lifetime, I don't know. It's a question of what the scale is and how clever we are and so on. Right. But I think that this whole idea of whether we are in a consistent bubble, so to speak, or whether we have to appeal to things sort of beyond our physics, is a reasonable question. I mean, there are things where I'm hoping that there are observations that we can make with telescopes, or maybe with other kinds of systems, but that there are observations that we can make in which this nasty, spiny parts of the ruliad will kind of poke through our usual continuum view of space. And so what you're asking, I think, is, in the case of conscious experience, is it enough to merely talk about kind of the laws of physics that we know, or is that a place where there's a poke through from something beyond kind of the laws of physics that we know?
I think that's a very important and useful question, and there's also another way of looking at this issue, and that is, if we're trying to build a scientific theory, and we're trying to find as few assumptions as possible for our scientific theory. We believe in Occam's razor, and we both agreed that as an observer, all I know are my conscious experiences. So whatever conscious experiences are, they're all I know as an observer. So in the ontology that I'm going to assume in my scientific theory, I have a big choice. I can either put conscious experiences in that ontology as foundational or not. And if I choose not to, then I've given myself the scientific duty to explain where those experiences come from. So I either postulate that I say up front, these are part of the ontology, these are the assumptions I make, or I say, no, they're not part of the assumptions. I therefore have the duty to explain consciously. So it's my choice. Now,
I would like to just to stop you for a second there. I mean, it depends on what kind of science you're doing.
Okay.
If you're doing psychology or something, if you're doing a science that is about that, then for sure. But one of the things that happens in science, it's not obvious that it would be possible, but it has proved possible, is that you can separately look at physics, biology, chemistry. They have interfaces, but you can choose to concentrate on one aspect of the world. And, an obvious question is there you might make the claim there is no meaningful science that can be done without entraining consciousness in it. That would be a potential claim. That is not what has been the observation of the last few hundred years of science. The last few hundred years of science has achieved a lot without solving the problem that you say nobody has solved, and I agree nobody has solved. So it's a question of what it is that you think you're going to do in your science. Now, when you talk about Occam's razor, and I don't know why Occam's razor is true. I mean, it's an interesting criterion. It's in a sense, the ruliad denies Occam's razor, because the ruliad has everything, all these kinds of things going on in it. At some level, from the point of view of abstract aesthetics, the ruliad is lovely because it assumes nothing. But from the point of view of is it saying, oh, the description of what's happening, for example, let's take an Occam's razor argument about what happens in a fluid. Okay? The Occam's razor argument would probably be, if the fluid is flowing from here to there, all the molecules inside it must be flowing in exactly that direction. That would be wrong.
Correct.
In other words, so, and in fact, what's true is there's very complicated stuff going on. It just happens that at the level of looking at the whole fluid, it can be described by saying the fluid goes from here to there. So I think it would be a mistake to say that there is something kind of, there's any necessity. If there's an Occam's razor that means anything, it means something because of the way our minds work. I mean, one key feature of our minds is that they're very finite. And, we take all the stuff going on in the world and we're trying to make a narrative about what's happening that is simple enough that we can stuff it in our minds and make inferences about it. And for that, Occam's razor is very useful. Occasionally things will poke through and be like, Occam was wrong type thing. But I think it's a feature. I think perhaps one could even argue, I've been on sort of the hunt for things that observers like us just take for granted. And I think in some sense, the simplicity of explanation is something that we implicitly take for granted.
If you enjoyed this toe clipping, then the full video is linked in the description. You should also sign up for Toe Mail, which is again in the description and the pinned comment. You'll receive immediate access to all exclusive updates from the Theories of Everything podcast. It also helps me communicate directly with the core toe community. You'll also receive my top 10 toes. Think of it as the intellectual version of Quentin Tarantino's Obsession.